Paul, I think that you reached the conclusion a long time ago, I guess initially for environmentalist reasons, and now for additional reasons, spiritual reasons, cultural reasons, that there's something inherently self-limiting about modernity, that there are problems with modernity which will out. And I've sort of ended up reaching the same conclusion, maybe via slightly different themes, but the same conclusion that this is not going to continue indefinitely. Should we start maybe by talking about your early environmentalist qualms about modernity per se?
Yeah, it's very interesting how so many people are kind of alighting on the same unpleasant conclusion from completely different angles at the moment, because it's increasingly inescapable, really. So for me, I mean, I became an environmental activist because I loved the natural world, because I loved the connection it gave me with something that was bigger than myself, I think now. And I became an activist at university, and I was in my early 20s, so I was young and arrogant and utopian and all the other things you are in your early 20s. And I thought that we could save the world. And back then this was the early 90s, so environmentalism was still fairly young. It wasn't ubiquitous like it is now. You wouldn't see climate change in the newspapers, for example. So it still felt quite radical. It hadn't been corporatized and colonized by all the mainstream narratives. And it felt to me anyway, that environmentalism was a challenge to modernity in the first place. And actually, if you look back at the origins of the movement and some of its pioneers and its thinkers, firstly, interestingly, quite a lot of them were quite conservative with a small c, traditionalist in the sense that they believed we needed to go back to human scale ways of living. But also they were very openly challenging the premises of the modern world, which really spoke to me because I felt even back then that there was something wrong with it, even though I couldn't quite explain what it was. So environmentalism for me was always a probably slightly romantic and probably unrealistic attempt to sort of turn the oil tanker of modernity around, from the perspective of the natural world, which it ravages and destroys. You can't separate industrialism, you can't separate modernity from about the 1800s or the 1700s onwards from the burning of fossil fuels. That's really, if there's one thing that changes the course of humanity, is discovering a ton of fossilized dinosaur bones and trees under the surface of the earth, which it turns out you can burn and create an incredibly intense burst of energy that there has been absolutely nothing like before. And once you've got through it, there will be nothing like again. And if you start to examine the history of the modern world, not just the obvious technological boosts that you get from that, but everything else, from obviously the creation of European empires, which are enabled through the technologies that fossil fuels creates, from the telegraph to the steamship, but also things like liberalism, the individualism that we enjoy, that we can experience because we have technology to liberate us from the things we needed to do as families and communities before. And the modern medical systems enable us to prevent our children dying so that we can have fewer of them, and all these other things. I mean, almost everything from liberalism to democracy to feminism to the internet is enabled by fossil fuels, which we now know are changing the climate. So we've got all that. Anyway, so environmentalism for me was a sort of attempt to turn this around, and it sort of becomes obvious fairly quickly that you can't turn it around. You cannot turn the fossil fuel economy off. Firstly, because we like it, even though we pretend sometimes that we don't. We like to blame the oil companies for climate change, and they are to blame, but so are we, because we like the things that modernity gives us, and even if we don't like them, we have to use them. And it's just the entire world now has become technologized and caught up in the system. You can't turn it around. And so what's happened is we are going through what I think is a giant pretense at the moment. And the pretense is that we can make the industrial economy sustainable. And what that means is we can somehow replace the intensity of fossil fuels with some other fuel source, whether it's renewables or nuclear or some other thing that they're just about to invent, but they never quite somehow do. There's no evidence that that can work at all. And there's no evidence that people are going to put up with an industrial economy that is not correct. There's no evidence that people are going to put up either with the consequences of the industrial economy or with the consequences of not having one, if you like. So we're all stuck in this bind. Anyway, the short version of the story is that I decided by the early 2000s that environmentalism was becoming unrealistic because it was calling for things which weren't possible, which included attempting to turn modernity around or to make industrialism sustainable by using wind farms and solar panels, or to save the earth in 100 days or whatever else was going on. And so when I started writing about that, it was still a fairly rare thing to say, I think, 15 years or so ago. It's become quite a common thing to say now. And I launched the Dark Mountain project with Dougal Hine in 2009, which was built on the basis of a manifesto in which we both sat down and said, look, this society is unsustainable and therefore it cannot be sustained. And if that's true, we ought to start living like it's true. And particularly as writers, we ought to start writing like it's true. And where does that leave us? And what we wanted to do was try and follow the logic of that down, which I suppose I've been doing since then. So yeah, environmentalism became, to me, a well-intentioned but completely unrealistic attempt to either make modernity sustainable or to stop it happening. And it's too late, in my view, to do either of them.
You know the three-part typology of environmentalists, the bright greens, the dark greens, the light greens. You're familiar with this. I mean, listeners who aren't, so the light greens are the sort of, I think what you're describing there, sort of mainstream environmentalist view of turn the tap off while you're brushing your teeth, put a solar panel on your house, like minor adjustments, but basically our lifestyle remains the same and we'll be okay. The bright greens are the radical technology people who say we just need to, colonize Mars, whatever, like the next frontier is what will solve this. And the dark greens, I was about to ask, I think is where you now find yourself, right? The whole thing is unsustainable, that the Industrial Revolution itself will end up destroying the planet one way or another.
Yeah, I would say so. Well, I mean, I've almost come out of the other side of that. I mean, that's where I found myself 15 years ago. Strangely enough, I find myself as an Orthodox Christian these days, which takes me beyond dark greenness as well. But yeah, absolutely. It gives you a whole other perspective, which we can talk about later. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was a dark green for a long time. That was the basis of the Dark Mountain project. And really, the dark greens versus the bright greens is the thing that's worth focusing on, because those are the two. I mean, the middle ground is neither here nor there, because this thing doesn't work. So you can either just be realistic and face up to that fact and see where it takes you, or you can try and continue busting through the limits, which is what the bright greens want to do. We create food in vats and we fly off to Mars and colonize that, and we mine the asteroids, and we somehow develop nuclear fission or fusion or whichever one it is that they're always about to invent. And there's always a miracle technology that's going to save us. That's the Elon Musk kind of worldview, which is very popular because it's a kind of a last ditch, I think.
You know that line from The Simpsons where Homer says, alcohol, the cause of and solution to all life's problems. So it's like technology, the cause of and solution to all life's problems.
That's where we
the
are,
bright green view. Yeah.
That's where we are. And you can't pretend that either of those things is not true. You have to have both at once.
But then the thing that frightens me about dark greens is I think that it's all very well. I don't mind about giving up flying. I don't like flying anyway. I don't mind about giving up whatever, like mass-produced fashion. There's all sorts of stuff that you could ditch, and actually we'd probably be happier for it. And maybe it would actually be better for us all to live more slowly and grow veg and keep chickens and stuff. That's fine. But there is a lot of other stuff actually that comes along with the Industrial Revolution, which we're going to miss dreadfully if and when we lose it. I'm thinking of things like sanitation, vaccines, modern medical technology, full stop. That's and also just the acknowledgement that if we don't have fossil fuels, we probably can't sustain the population size that we have right now. And so, and what's the route to getting there, right? Like, there's a lot of very, very frightening thoughts lurking behind this typology.
I think the problem comes when you turn any of these perceptions into a political position. So the dark green thing is useful in the sense that it can give you a very realistic, astringent political position where or not political position, but an understanding of where we are, and where we just say, look, this thing has happened. We're in here now, but it's not going to go on. So it's going to end up fading away. If you turn that into a political position whereby you think that you have to destroy industrial society in order to save the planet, and there are a few people like that around, then you very quickly become a kind of dangerous misanthropist, and I've known a few of them, and been on the verge of becoming one at times in my life as well, I have to say, because if you really love the natural world and can see what's being done to it by industrialism, then it's a logical position. The only way to save the planet is to destroy industrial society. And there's a logic to that, actually. But obviously, it can lead to horrors. And anyway, it's no more realistic than flying to Mars because you're not going to do it. But you're right. There isn't thing is, we've got ourselves into a situation that there isn't a comfortable or easy way out of. There's no simple solution because it's not a problem. It's not a mathematical puzzle that you can somehow solve. It's just, we did a thing. We discovered all these fuels and we went, oh, great, look at this. And then we had this huge kind of festival of invention and creation, which has completely reshaped the world. We're now completely dependent on it, and it's destroying us, and it's destroying the ecology of the planet. And there is not an easy way out of that. We just have to somehow bumble through whatever's going to come, which is probably not going to be pleasant. But I just don't. I think that anyone who offers an easy solution, whether it's primitivism or escaping to another planet, is offering something foolish and dangerous.
And there's no historical template for this because this hasn't happened before.
No, there isn't.
We've not done an industrial revolution before.
It's like what it's like is like the collapse of an empire, which is what it is. But it's an empire on a global scale. It's the human empire, and it's a technological empire, the like of which we haven't had before. I mean, all empires have been technological. We've had fairly advanced technologies at different stages in history. I mean, the Egyptians did, the Romans did, although of course it was all based on human slavery rather than fossil fuels. So it's not as if we haven't lived in empires which have collapsed before, but this is a global one. It's a global empire, and the technology and the number of people and the sophistication doesn't have a precedent, like you say. So there's no roadmap to it. We don't have any easy answers.
My husband sometimes accuses me of being his expression is collapscard, and my lovely listeners have actually set up a book club. I've actually set up a book club in association with the podcast called the Collapstards Book Club, right? It's obviously a joke, but I do sometimes wonder in myself if I am psychologically primed to expect this kind of disaster, not least because millenarianism is such an important aspect of Christian thinking. Do you wonder the same, if to some extent this feeling that we're rushing up into a void, which I feel very strongly, might actually be a sort of a psychological artifact, or might be, I don't know, a temperamental urge in some people?
That's interesting. When we launched the Dark Mountain Project, we got called a lot of names. And one of my favorites was Crazy Collapsitarian, which is, I think, pretty good. So it's very similar to Collapstards.
That's basically what Collapstards means, yeah.
It's the same thing. We got a lot of people telling us that we were depressed and we needed to see psychologists instead of writing manifestos. I think there's a couple of things, aren't there? So firstly, there's definitely a temperamental type which likes to look at these things, which you probably are, and I certainly am. I am just a bit of a doomer. And there's no doubt about it. I've written 9 books, and if you read them, it's impossible to deny it. So there it is. It doesn't mean that the thing is not happening. It just means that some people like to look at it and talk about it and write about it and analyze it, and other people want to just avoid it or get on with their lives. Often people, when they talk about things like being a collapsed-tard, there's a kind of sense of superiority in it. They like to think of themselves as the good people and you as the baddie who likes to focus on the negatives. Maybe that can be true sometimes, but it's also possible that they're in denial and you're just facing the reality, which is another way of looking at the situation. Because if this is true, then it's an important thing to be looking at. And I think it is true. And you don't do yourself any favors by pretending it's not happening because you don't like it, which is a very common human reaction to any kind of pain, which is what this is, right? Just avoid it, hope it goes away. Maybe someone else will deal with it, put it off till the last minute. That's what we're doing as a society. I think it's, we're going through the stages of grief and we're still somewhere in between denial and bargaining. I think that's what we're doing. Denial is pretending it's not happening. Bargaining is putting up the solar panels and the wind farms. Eventually you have to come to acceptance. Maybe some people just come to acceptance more quickly. That's another way of looking at it. The Christian thing is interesting because it's true that Christianity is focused on, it ends with an apocalypse, which then turns into a new beginning. And so there's probably a cultural sense of that. Having said that, my wife comes from an Indian family. Her parents moved to England from India in the 60s. And so she's born in Britain like me, but her family are Indian. So her religion is Sikh. And the Sikhs believe, like all Indian religions, really, they believe in a kind of great cycle of ages. And the age that we're in at the moment, according to the Sikhs, is called the Kal Yug, which the Hindus call the Kali Yuga, which is this dark age in which everything is collapsing, in which truth is impossible to see, everything is smothered by lies, everything's falling apart. And after the Kal Yug comes a collapse, but then the cycle begins again and you go through all these different ages. So that's not a Christian perspective, but it's still a perspective which is able to see that there come times where things just collapse and fall away and disintegrate. And then you have to go back to the beginning again. So whether you see it as a kind of apocalyptic ending and then a return to the kingdom of God, which I suppose is a Christian perspective, or a endless number of cycles in which this stuff keeps on happening, lots of different cultures have this understanding that there are times when things just collapse and everything comes apart. And interestingly, when I talk to my wife about the Kal Yug, there's a lot of concentration there on deceit and humans' denial about the situation and the deceit of their rulers and the sense of kind of moral collapse. And again, you can look at accounts of life in the late Roman Empire, and you can see the same sort of thing being recorded. So it's true that there's a Christian sense of apocalypse, but it's also true that societies collapse all the time, endlessly. Every empire that's ever existed has collapsed, and this one is now collapsing too. That's the way I see it. It's just that this collapse, which will probably be slow and take centuries, is global rather than regional, and that's the difference.
Yeah, the slow and take centuries point is an important one, because I think that maybe disaster movies have primed us for this, to think of a great event, that may always be on the horizon. I remember reading such a great Substack essay by an anonymous writer a little while ago about the political fantasy inherent in zombie apocalypse movies, where what happens in zombie apocalypse movies is that there's a single event, there's a day zero where something disastrous happens. And what inevitably happens is that our hero, who's a sort of small town American male, who's undervalued in his own time, his skills become enormously important, and he's sort of vindicated because he's able to flourish in this basically post-political landscape where there are no people left. There are just rampaging zombies, and you just have to kind of fend for you. There's like an American individualist fantasy, I think, in the zombie apocalypse movie. But that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about a single event. We're talking about a gradual disintegration. As the world becomes smaller, things we used to have available to us are no longer available to us. Technology stops working, stops developing. Everything just kind of retreats. That seems that seems to have been mostly what happened with Rome. Obviously, you have some dramatic moments, but generally, this it takes centuries is actually the norm historically. And yeah, it's happened to everyone before us, so there's really no reason to think it won't happen to us too.
Yeah, the zombie thing makes me think of Tremors with Kevin Bacon, which, if you haven't seen it, it's one of the world's best films. Fantastic. It's just like a zombie apocalypse, except with giant underground worms. And it's exactly that story. A bunch of small town hicks save the world, or at least save their community. It's great. It's actually, I wrote some essays during the COVID pandemic, which got me into trouble. But one of them was because they were a critique of the response to the pandemic. But one of them actually I wrote a bit about how we had primed and actually been primed by so many disaster films about deadly viruses to behave towards COVID as if it were the deadly virus that we'd seen on the films. And so we immediately reacted, and our governments reacted as if this is the big one, here it comes, lock yourself inside, it's going to kill everybody. And then actually it turned out not to be that bad. And arguably the response was a lot worse than the pandemic. But we responded, and certainly the media responded, in exactly the way that we'd seen on the films about deadly viruses, like 28 Days Later or something, where everybody dies except 5% of the population. And yes, there's a hero who comes to sort of put everything right again, or at least to survive. And we've been so primed by that story that we exist within it. So we like one of the points we made in the Dark Mountain Manifesto actually is that there's two stories we like, as a culture. And one of them is exactly that. It's apocalypse. Everything suddenly ends, right? So there's a nuclear war, there's a deadly virus, there's a zombie attack, endless numbers of films and stories about that. You wake up one day and everything's dead, and then you have to get your gun out and you have to fight the zombies. And there is a kind of purist relief to it. It's like, yeah, all the crap's over. No more culture war, no more going to work. I just have to kill zombies now. It's like refreshing.
Exactly.
It's like we're back to the
Post-political
basic
fantasy.
stuff of life.
Yeah.
It's you or the zombie. And, it's that's a story that we like, even though we wouldn't want to live through it in a way. It's recognizable. And the other story that we like is the Star Trek story, which is the story that Elon Musk and his crew are living in, which is the sort of liberal democracy and progress go on forever and ever. And they expand out into the universe. And we have a kind of galactic UN, and we're all flying around in spaceships, and we can live forever and teleport. And that's attractive as well, because it will be fun to live in that. But the actual future is possibly going to be more like the long drawn out collapse of Rome or any other culture that takes so long that at the time you're not even necessarily aware that you're living in it in quite the same way. Things just grind down over a long period, which seems to me is what's already happening. When people talk about the collapse of Rome, incidentally, from the perspective of an Orthodox Christian, it's quite interesting because, of course, Rome, the Western Roman Empire the Western Roman Empire declined, but the center of Rome moved to the east, so it moved to Constantinople. And technically, the Roman Empire didn't end until the 15th century when Islam finally conquered Constantinople. So that was in its own sort of decline. It was a very long, drawn-out period of all sorts of things happening. There's no obvious explosion where the barbarians just pour into the gates one day and then that's the end of that. There's an American writer, John Michael Greer.
Well, we still have the Roman Catholic Church.
Well, we do indeed. I was going to say there's an American writer, John Michael Greer, who has this phrase. In fact, he wrote a book based on this phrase, the long descent, which is how he frames the same thing, which is, I think, a really good way of looking at it. That's what we're going through already. We're going through a long descent, and that it will be punctuated by periods of collapse and horror and awfulness, and then probably periods of stability and decline, and maybe even some times when things look like they're getting better. But over several centuries, it's a good bet that industrialism will just fade away and we'll be somewhere else that won't look quite like pre-modernity, but certainly won't look like modernity either. And that would be, if I had to put money on something that I won't be around to see, that's probably what it would be.
A return to the human norm.
Yeah,
that seems overwhelmingly to be the most likely outcome.
And that's the thing. And as I say, fossil fuels, for better or for worse, have completely changed absolutely everything about the way that we live in fundamental ways. They've even allowed us to believe we've abolished religion, for example, because we don't need it anymore. And yeah, we will be returning to the human norm, which is better in some ways and worse in others.
And people are going to become more religious. I mean, as I the two. This, of course, feeds into the birth rates question as well, right? And one of the things that I've been forced to conclude from looking at the data on fertility rates cross-culturally is that there seems to be something, I don't know, something in the human brain where you reach a certain level of comfort and affluence and people lose a desire to reproduce. Not just lose the desire to have 2.1 kids, lose the desire to have any kids. And this seems to be a really consistent thing across our species. The only exceptions are some, we've mentioned Elon Musk already, right? Some eccentric billionaires and a country like Israel, which isn't really representative because it faces such severe security threats, but is quite fertile and is wealthy. But apart from that, this seems to be a very, very, very strong trend. And what it makes me wonder about is whether or not that suggests that in some way modernity cannot last, because if as soon as you reach that threshold of abundance, technological sophistication, affluence, peace, comfort, all of these things, our revealed preference is that we like these things, we strive for them as human beings, but that as soon as you hit that point, the society starts to collapse in on itself because people stop wanting to reproduce. And so, right now, the people who are continuing to reproduce, apart from the world's poor, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, are religious people. Overwhelmingly, there's a best predictor, and it even down to the fine grain of how often you go to church predicts how many children you'll have on average. Going once a week versus once a month versus once a year tracks fertility. So I'm forced to conclude that basically religion is going to have the last laugh, and soon. That secularism, as we know it, seems to be self-deleting. Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we really can't understand the world or ourselves without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to point you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM.
I think so. I think secularism is another one of these products of modernity. Secularism comes from liberalism. Liberalism comes from Enlightenment rationalism. That comes from a certain type of Protestantism. Add that to fossil fuels, the scientific revolution, etc. You get a very culturally contingent thing, which really comes from the Western world and calls itself secularism, and for a time lives on this fantasy. And I think it is a fantasy that you can somehow create a rationalist public space where people can be religious or not be religious. It's entirely up to them. I grew up believing religion would fade away because that's what we all thought. I mean, I'm 50 now. I'm just over 50, and that was what our generation thought. Religion will fade away because it's nonsense. It was just stories people told before they had science. We don't need it anymore. So there's still a few religious people down in the poor bits of the world, but the richer they get, the more religious they'll stop being. There are more religious people in the world today than there were when I was born. Atheism and secularism are a tiny proportion of the planet, and they exist in this very, very modern, quote, developed part of the world where, as you say, people have stopped having children. We're also very clearly in a place of cultural disintegration. We're rejecting all of our ancestral stories. We are confused about our gender. We are having an endless ongoing culture war. We don't function as a culture anymore. We're ripping ourselves apart for whatever reason. And as you say, the birth rate's collapsing, and that's requiring a project of mass immigration to keep the economies going, which isn't sustainable either because it's a Ponzi scheme, because when the immigrants get old, they'll need more immigrants, and eventually you run out of immigrants. The whole thing doesn't work. And we're already in a position of trying to prop up this system, which at almost every level doesn't seem healthy. If it was healthy, we'd be the happiest people in the world, and I'm pretty sure we're not. So yeah, I think it's interesting. Again, as an Orthodox Christian, I come across people with big families all the time. Interestingly, especially Americans, I meet a lot of American Orthodox Christians. Some of them have got 6 or 8 children, and in Eastern Europe, people still often have larger families than we do in the West. And it's quite converted me. I have 2 children, but I regard big families as a really lovely thing. And I've seen so many of these Orthodox families that are just seems much more natural and normal. But I think absolutely religion, if you take religion seriously, if you believe there is a God, then God is somewhere in your heart, and you need to connect with him all the time. And we have tried to create a society in which we don't do that because we don't believe in it. And so if you dethrone God, if you remove him from the center of your culture, and every culture that's ever existed has had God or the gods at the heart of the culture somehow. If you dethrone God, you have to put something else on the throne, because there's always a throne. And what we've put on the throne is ourselves. So we worship ourselves. We worship the self. We use technology to make the self live as long as possible. The self wants to colonize Mars. The self wants to go on and on and on. Worship of the self, of course, is what the devil does. That's Lucifer's offer. So off we go. We worship the self, and we start to eat ourselves, and then we fall apart. And so religion is a cultural system which, for all of its flaws, helps us to focus on the bigger picture. And so a society that has religion at its heart will have hope, and it will have belief in something beyond the self and something beyond our personal desire. And every religious system I've ever come across tells its adherents to put their personal desires second and focus on God and focus on other people and focus on community. Jesus tells us to love our neighbor all the time because we can see God in our neighbor and God in our enemy as well. Come to that. And that's the opposite of worshipping the self. There's an essay I wrote in my book about the machine that I'm putting together, and when I talked about modern science and magic and how they come from the same root. And I wrote a bit about Aleister Crowley, who's increasingly seems to be a kind of symbolic figure for the modern world. And of course, his famous dictum is "do what thou wilt." And that's what we do. Do what thou wilt is pretty much the mantra of the modern age. And you oppose it to the Christian mantra, if you like, teaching, which is "thy will be done," which is what we say to God. So we've got "do what thou wilt," which is the modern formulation, versus "thy will be done," which is the traditional one. And the traditional one is going to win out, because we've tried to build a culture based on just fulfilling our personal pleasure. And ironically, it's not even giving us much pleasure at this point. It's just looking a bit horrible and decadent. And so, everywhere I look as well, I see religion winning out. As you've written somewhere, the Amish are growing, the Mormons are growing, the Orthodox are growing, and all the secularists are all shrinking. So give that another couple of generations, we just fade away. Cheery thought.
Well, I mean, it is in a way, right?
So
Like
it is and it isn't. Yeah. But
if
it
the
is. I mean,
alternative is human extinction,
yeah.
yeah.
Well, I think, here's the thing. This stuff all sounds very doomy to a certain type of person, but to me, it's optimistic. This is my perverted brand of optimism, because, I think there is God, and I think there's a way to live in relationship to God, and I think there's a way to live in relationship to our families and our communities, and without idealizing the past, which we should try and avoid doing, because, it had plenty of problems, as does the present. We can say that that way of living actually does give us a sense of hope and forward motion. Whereas this one, which is supposed to make us look forward, and we call ourselves progressive after all, it doesn't seem to be doing that. It seems to me to be making us depressed and nihilistic and selfish and almost suicidal at this point culturally, because it's not based on the truth. It's based on self-worship, and it's a delusion. And so if it's a delusion, it has to end.
I think the reason that this isn't actually a doomer story, even though it sort of looks like it, is because it provides really very good evidence that Christianity is true.
Mm.
It's not as though we're being kind of smited by thunderbolts per se, right? But it does seem to be the case that living against Christianity, rejecting it, living in ways that are in direct opposition to what the Bible teaches, causes harm, causes people to be unhappy, causes problems, it seems to be an almighty error, I say advisedly, almighty error. And I think that the people who, and some of this is proved through the birthright thing, some of this is proved through, yes, as you say, the worship of the self, and how that seems to very, very reliably make people utterly miserable and cause terrible social problems. And if Christianity is true, then that's a good thing. Because it means the Christian promise is true as well.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? It's because you mentioned the smiting, and the smiting is a very Old Testament way of seeing something. And I think about this a lot, and I think, what does this mean? And what it means, I think, is there are simply consequences to your actions. So the Christian story is that we are created as free individuals right from the beginning, right in the Garden of Eden. And God says, okay, here are the rules. Here's how you should live. But you're free to do what you want. But by the way, don't eat that, because if you eat that, there will be consequences. And we do eat that, and then there are consequences. And the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, for example, which is the removal of human beings from their original connection with God and connection with the rest of creation, and falling away into work and labor and self-centeredness and war, and interestingly, industrial society, which develops just 2 generations after the fall as a consequence of it. That's simply a consequence of our actions. It's not even a punishment as such. It's a consequence. God says, here are the rules. Here's how you live. You can either live in communion with me, and you can grow in communion with me, or you can go off and follow your own path, which, by the way, that snake, who is the devil, will want you to do, because that's his offer. And that's the offer we choose right from the beginning. We choose to follow that path of the self. And then there are just consequences. The Tower of Babel falls down. Sodom and Gomorrah collapse. Empires fall. The Israelites spend 40 years in the wilderness. Moses goes up the mountain and he comes down to find them worshipping a golden calf. So that's the end of that as well. We repeatedly fall away from the law of God, and then we get corrected. And we don't have to be struck down by lightning. We get corrected by the consequences of the failure of what we do. The thing we create just doesn't work. We build the tower collapses because it can't exist, because it doesn't operate within the law of God. So that's the story as I understand it. And it is, as you say, quite simple. It shows you that there is a moral law, there is a universal law, there is a law of God, and you know what it is. You know how to live. And however imperfectly you try to live it, you know what to do. And if you decide you're going to rebel against it, which is what we've done for hundreds of years, yeah, you're going to have a fall. The tower's going to come down. And I think the tower's coming down with us inside it at the moment.
The thing I wonder about, though, is whether or not technology itself is in some way in defiance of that moral law. Because people have pursued, I mean, sometimes people have pursued technological innovation for selfish and hubristic reasons, but often not. Often it's pursued with the best possible intentions. The overwhelmingly English men who say invented vaccination or modern sewage systems or any of these things which have saved countless lives, they were Christians, and they did this with the best possible intentions, and they didn't know, and they couldn't know that it would produce, say, overpopulation and all the problems that would lead to. I mean, we can say now, looking at the sequence of events of the Industrial Revolution and onwards, that you have this kind of cascade of, is that what they talk about in childbirth, the intervention cascade, right? You intervene in one way in the natural process of childbirth, and then you have to intervene again, and then you have to intervene again. You have to remedy the side effects of that intervention. That's what you see in the Industrial Revolution. But people did it with the best possible intentions, and the Bright Greens are doing it with the best possible intentions. Is it still possible that that's still wrong? Is it still, should we be more opposed to technology per se?
Well, I'm instinctively opposed to it, but that's me. I mean, everything is usually done with the best of intentions. Most people think they have good intentions. So very few people probably say to themselves, I'm going to go and do something really evil now. I'm going to do this thing. I'm going to do an evil thing. You can always find the best of intentions, but you're right. I mean, the people who started the Industrial Revolution were Christians. The people who started the Scientific Revolution were Christians. The Enlightenment thinkers were Christians. And there's a strong strain of thinking within Christianity which says God has given us these gifts, and so we have to use them. We're supposed to be co-creators here, and
Not
so
least
this is what we do
intelligence.
with technology. Yeah. So, and there's something to that.
Yeah.
Because humans are questing creatures, and we can't just sit here and do nothing. We have these skills, we have these brains, we have these opposable thumbs. We do things, we create things. Building a cathedral over 100 years is an enormously complex technological process, if you like. So there's a notion that the historian Ronald Wright developed, which he called the progress trap, which is another way of just talking about what you were just talking about with the cascades, whereby we develop a technology to solve a problem. It then causes new problems. Then you have to develop a bunch of new technologies to solve that one. So for example, we developed the Green Revolution back in the 1960s, and we go, look at this. This is fantastic. We can double food production. But of course, we've done it through creating artificial pesticides and fertilizers. They rely on fossil fuels. They also destroy the natural world. They kill off the insects. They destroy the soil. So then you've got to do something about that. And every time the progress trap, the ratchet is kind of tightened, you're going deeper and deeper and deeper into a reliance on technology. And then you get to the point where you can't back out now because you have so many complex things going on. That's pretty much where we are at the moment. We can't stop using technology, even if we want to. We can limit it in our lives. I try to limit it in mine. But I can't live without the internet. I can't live without a car. I can't live without various things. I just have to function. It's just the way it is.
We both make a living on the internet.
Well, everybody does. I mean, like I said, my Indian
Yeah.
mother-in-law, who moved from the Punjab in the 60s and has never used any technology in her life apart from a telephone, she's had to get a tablet just to use her bank account. She goes down the local bank; they won't let her take the money out. So this is how it goes. You're wound into this thing deeper and deeper all the time. I tend to think that maybe the answer with technology is, again, spiritual. So the answer is not never to use any technology, because how would you even do that? Language is a technology. Fire is a technology. Humans can't not do that. But if you put technology to a kind of spiritual test or a community test, then you're asking yourself what you're developing it for, and maybe you have more of a chance of controlling it. So a good example would be the Amish, which we mentioned earlier, who I'm no means an expert on, but my understanding of this is that in an Amish community, technology is always put to a test. So a new piece of technology will be introduced, say smartphones. The Amish will say, right, we'll try smartphones for a year. And everything's done through community meetings. So they'll introduce the phone in their community, and then they will monitor how it actually impacts them, how it impacts their religious life, their community life, their family life. And then they'll meet again in another year and they'll say, right, should we keep this or not? And some of them decide to, and some of them decide not to. And you can say to yourself, what does this technology do? Does it cause community harm? Does it sever me from nature? Does it mean that I'm on a screen all day and I don't talk to my family? Does it do something to my concentration span? What does it do to the natural world? How do we judge this? Having a critical, intelligent attitude to technology, and also asking who technology serves. Does it serve God? Does it serve your community? Does it serve your selfishness? Does it serve greed? Does it serve capitalism? Whatever. Those are the questions that we almost never ask. We just go, is it cool? Does it make things go faster? Can it create a profit? Yay. And even if we don't like it, it's inevitable, so we just have to do it anyway. And it's a kind of ignorant, childish way of responding to technology. And because we live in a society that worships technology, because it's the only thing that we think could save us from almost any of our problems, we have a completely uncritical attitude to it. So again, the answer is probably not destroy all the machines, which you can't do, or just bring on everything because it's all fantastic. It's to have an intelligent attitude and to ask yourself what the machines are actually serving. Which God are they serving?
There is a political programme that comes out of this, though, right? I mean, I know we spoke earlier about the simplistic kind of political offerings of, say, the bright greens or the light greens, but you have to reach some very political conclusions from looking at our past and our future in these terms. You can't. I mean, for one thing, so going back to the birth rates question, for instance, people say, you mentioned mass immigration as a sticking plaster for this, or indeed, I mean, any number of there are also some disturbing transhumanist visions of sort of growing babies in vats and so on, so that you can keep feeding the economic growth engine. I look at this and I think, well, or maybe we just have to let the welfare state die.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's only existed for like 100 years out of 200,000 years of human history. Like maybe the idea that you just have to keep growing GDP in order to maintain this, given that we live in a world with finite resources, and just the land mass of Britain, thinking just about Britain, is really just not that large in the end, right? Maybe what this means is actually all of this stuff that cannot exist without constant population growth actually cannot exist, full stop. And so how do we get there? I mean, we're talking just after the general election, where every single party has promised pensions protection and more money for the NHS, and just funneling more and more money into a welfare system which is very new and clearly very unsustainable. I mean, the political point that pops out of what we're talking about in a grander at the grander scale is also at the modest scale. We can't do that. Sorry, we have to. This isn't sustainable,
Yeah,
and no voter base wants to hear that.
no, they don't. And look at the things that almost all the political parties promised in Britain. So on the one hand, we're going to lower immigration, but we're also going to have economic growth. And we're also going to protect nature, and we're also going to build loads more houses. And the NHS is going to be funded forever, and it's going to work really well. And you're all going to get great pensions. And those things do not fit together. And oh, by the way, we're also going to get to net zero carbon, and et cetera, et cetera. They don't fit. But as you say, because we're all dependent on this machine, we don't want anything to be taken away because we depend on the things, or we just like the things. And the things we've become dependent on in just the last few decades, which never existed when I was a kid, the internet being the most obvious one, but also the holidays people think they need, and then we consumer crap that they think they need, that people now imagine they can't live without. The NHS was only created when my mum was born. And even then it was a fairly limited thing. and now it's expected to do absolutely everything for absolutely everyone all the time, and we worship it like a god. And it is unsustainable. And politically, the realistic thing to do is to say, okay, yeah, look, I mean, interestingly, this is what some of the Green parties tried to do for a while, and some of them still do, is to say, actually, look, you need a transition, right? So you've got to transition from this high energy destructive culture to a low energy, non-destructive culture that is sustainable. And people have written books on this. They've laid out whole plans and programs about it. There's some intelligent stuff out there, but no one's going to ever vote for it. That's the basic problem. No one is ever going to choose it, because you have to choose a self-limiting lifestyle. And even if by some miracle one country could be persuaded to vote for some smaller scale, lower technology, more sustainable way of living, it would still operate within a global economy, which would destroy it financially within about 2 seconds. And then the Americans would invade. Something would happen, and, it's because you're operating in this global system now where everything is highly technologized, if you like. It's almost impossible, certainly impossible for me. I come to a dead end thinking about it, to imagine how you could elect a future. So the only conclusion I've come to is that has to be done small scale within local communities, in a way that's got to come back to the Amish again, the way that they do that. Small scale localism can work, still difficult. But I've come to a sort of, if I have to think about politics, which I've sort of retreated from just because I got so stuck with it, and I don't think it's the solution. I'd rather concentrate on prayer, which I'm much less good at than thinking about politics. But it's much more important. So I've got that project. But the only solution that I can come to in terms of solutions is I think we're on this long descent. We're in this long collapse. And so the rational thing is to be very clear-headed about what's going on, not to delude yourself. At the same time, not to try and wallow in doom, because here we all are and the world is still beautiful. But to, think about small-scale local alternatives, how you can actually make a community work, how you can rebuild the things that you need, whether that's how to communicate with your neighbors and cooperate with them, or what technology you would need, or what food you can grow. We do a little bit of that on the land we moved to here in Ireland, but it's just a small-scale thing. But the communities that are going to survive, probably in the long term, will be people who have religion, people who have good numbers of children because they have religion, people who have strong families, people who are living in communities with others who think like that, who are sharing things, have an intelligent, critical attitude to technology. Those people have a better chance of coming through than anyone else, because, as you say, they're actually realistic in terms of what the world is. We think that we're a terribly realistic culture, but we're actually living in a fantasy. So that, to me, seems to be the best way forward, because you're not going to get a political party that's going to promise you anything that will ever get elected by anybody. It goes at a more fundamental human level than that, I think.
Yeah, and I think that when political parties do employ environmentalist agendas, you mentioned net zero. I mean, like on the micro scale, but one environmentalist policy supposedly, which I really don't like because I think it's actually class warfare in disguise, is ULEZ in London. This is a very parochial issue for, as a Londoner, but it's basically a tax on people using polluting vehicles in central London. And what it means in practice is that tradesmen who are normally white working class, who have been displaced from London over the last few decades, who live outside of London and need to drive in order to perform their trades, whatever it is, and need to bring their tools, and so can't use public transport, and who can't afford to buy fancy new eco vehicles, that they basically get taxed with the full knowledge that they're not Labour voters anyway. And so the Labour mayoralty can just persecute them basically without any consequences, except that, I mean, there's been the sort of minor local battles over ULEZ cameras being destroyed by activists and stuff like that. I mean, it's all very small scale, but it's an example of this actually environmentalism being used as a stick with which to beat one's political enemies, which is, I think, normally what you actually see happening in practice when environmentalist aims are pursued by governments. It's not really that. It doesn't. I mean, as if ULEZ is going to make any difference whatsoever to our. It might make some difference, I suppose, to air pollution, but it's not going to make any difference to our carbon emissions as a nation. I think we should be very alert to the misuse of these ideas.
The trouble is here, because we're so dependent on this machine. We've all become interlocked into the industrial system. We're completely dependent upon it, but we know that system is environmentally destructive. And if it's true that the climate is changing at the rate at which a lot of the scientists seem to think it's changing, you need to radically reduce its emissions, and no one's going to vote for that. So you've got into a political binary here where the Greens are using big sticks to beat people, and not even very effectively, it has to be said, because the emissions aren't going down at all. People then resent that, and then there's a reaction against it. So on the one hand, you have a sort of left green group of people who seem to think we should use the state to be as authoritarian as possible to protect the planet. And then on the other hand, you've got a bunch of people on the right who increasingly hate the Greens, and so they want to pretend that climate isn't even changing at all and we should be able to drive and fly as much as we like and screw all the hippies. And neither of those is a sustainable solution. It's just turned into a culture war battle. It's a left-right battle, but it stems from the fact that we are all dependent on the machine for our lives, and any reduction in its activities is going to affect us negatively. That's just the reality. But because we live in a democracy, everyone's pretending that's not true, including the Greens. They're all pretending that we can have a lovely future that we can all elect, but we can't. We're actually going to have to cut a load of stuff out. People would have to stop driving and flying and using the internet at anything like the level they do at the moment to make modernity remotely sustainable, even if that were possible. And no one's going to vote for that. So you end up backing into a kind of green authoritarianism, which then creates a reaction. And then you're stuck in a political fight again. And it's because of that dependency on the machine that we all have, because nobody wants their stuff to be taken away from them. And as you say, there's a class element to it. And the Greens tend to be middle class, and the people who don't have a voice tend not to be. So that's the way that works out. And it's always easy to beat the working class with a stick and pretend you're doing it for the planet as well.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.